For weeks that broke me quietly. Imagine waking up on an ordinary morning in America. No storm outside. No dramatic phone call. No crisis. And yet, inside your head, one quiet question keeps repeating. Should I stop trying? If you are learning English, living in the US, or trying to rebuild your life far from home, you probably know this feeling better than you want to admit. My last 4 weeks in America were not loud failures. Nothing collapsed overnight. There were no big scenes. Just small cracks. And strangely, small cracks are the ones that make people give up. During the first week, I told myself I was fine. I had been through harder things before. I still drove my car. I still went to the grocery store. I still smiled and nodded when people talked to me. But nodding does not mean understanding. One day, at a checkout counter, I heard a very simple question. Do you want the receipt? My brain froze for 2 seconds. 2 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in those 2 seconds, my heart started racing. I answered slowly. My voice became smaller. And somehow I felt smaller too. In the second week, the tiredness began to pile up. Not physical tiredness. Mental tiredness. In America, everything moves fast. Conversations are short. Systems are efficient. Rules are clear. But emotions don't move at the same speed. You are expected to listen fast, understand fast, respond fast. Inside, all you want is more time. I started avoiding conversations. Silence felt safer because silence makes fewer mistakes. But silence has a cost. It makes you lonely, even when people are around. One evening, my partner and I were having dinner together. We weren't arguing. No conflict. No anger. Just a long, heavy pause between us. Back home, that silence might be filled with a casual question or a joke. Here, I had to think in English first, then translate it into emotion. By the time the emotion arrived, the moment had already passed. Marriages don't break from one big explosion. They slowly wear down from moments that never get spoken. By the third week, self-doubt moved in quietly. How many years had I studied English? How many videos had I watched? How many podcasts had I listened to? Then why did everyday conversations still feel like a test? Your brain loves asking questions like that. And it's very good at giving the wrong answers. It whispers, maybe you don't belong here. Or worse, maybe you're just not good enough. Here's something people don't tell you often. Enough. Your brain is not failing. It is overloaded. When you live in a new country, your brain processes new weather, new culture, new rules, new social cues, and a new language at the same time. It's like running a marathon while solving math problems. Feeling exhausted doesn't mean you are weak. It means you are doing something extremely difficult in silence. The fourth week was my quiet breaking point. No tears. No drama. Just emptiness. I sat in my car in a wide parking lot and thought, if I could start over, would I do this again? That question wasn't tragic. It was honest. And maybe you've asked yourself the same thing about English, about America, or about a relationship you're trying to save. Something unexpected happened during that fourth week. I started understanding a little more. Not because I studied harder, but because I stopped forcing myself to understand everything. I began hearing familiar phrases repeated every day. Take your time. No worries. It's okay. Very simple English. Phrases I had heard before but never truly listened to because I was too busy worrying about being wrong. Learning English is a lot like living in America. You don't fail because you're slow. You fail when you believe you must be as fast as everyone else. When I allowed myself to slow down, my ears opened. I didn't take notes. I didn't memorize vocabulary. I just lived. And I stayed long enough for the language to soak in, the way weather slowly sinks into your skin. If you're standing at the edge of giving up, I don't want to tell you empty words like, stay strong. I just want to tell you this. For weeks of repeated failure do not define who you are. They only prove that you are on a real journey. And real journeys are quiet, exhausting, and full of doubt. The real question isn't, did you fail? The real question is, after failing like this, would you try again? When love and language collide. Have you ever noticed how your brain chooses the worst possible moment to fail you? Not during practice. Not when you're alone. But when someone you care about is waiting for your answer. That was week 2 bleeding into week 3 for me in America. On the surface, nothing looked wrong. We had a routine. We had food on the table. We had plans. But underneath, something fragile was cracking quietly, where language and love collide. And if you've ever lived in a country where your heart feels faster than your words, you already know how dangerous that place can be. In the US, communication is direct. People say what they mean. They expect clarity. But when English is not your first language, clarity costs energy. Every sentence is a small calculation. Tone, timing, vocabulary. And when the topic is emotional, money, stress, future plans, your brain suddenly has too many tabs open. One night, my partner asked a simple question. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't dramatic. It was just honest. And I understood the words. But I couldn't catch the feeling fast enough. I knew what I wanted to say. I felt it clearly. But translating emotion into English felt like trying to grab smoke with my hands. I paused too long. I chose the wrong word. My sentence came out flat, almost cold. And I watched disappointment appear, not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't show that I cared in time. This is something no language course prepares you for. English textbooks teach you how to order food. They don't teach you how to protect a relationship when your words arrive late. By the 3rd week, I started realizing something uncomfortable. My English wasn't just affecting my confidence. It was shaping how I showed up in my marriage. When you can't express yourself fully, you start shrinking. You avoid deep conversations. You postpone important topics. You say, it's fine. When it's not, because it's fine is easy to say. And over time, that distance becomes normal. Here's the strange part. Love doesn't disappear in these moments. It waits. Quietly. But waiting too long creates misunderstandings. Your partner might think you don't care. You might think you're failing as a person. And your brain, always helpful, starts whispering again, maybe you're not built for this life. But let me tell you what was really happening. My brain wasn't broken. It was protecting me. Neuroscience shows that when we feel emotionally unsafe, the brain shifts into defense mode. Language processing slows down. Listening becomes harder. Your ears literally close, not because you're bad at English, but because your nervous system thinks you're under threat. That's why arguments in a second language feel 10 times harder. Your brain is choosing survival over fluency. Once I understood that, something changed, not dramatically, but gently. I stopped trying to sound smart. I stopped trying to explain everything perfectly. I started using smaller sentences, slower ones, more honest ones. Sometimes all I could say was, I'm tired. I care. I just need time. And surprisingly, that was enough. That's when I noticed something else. My listening improved, not during lessons, but during real life. When I stopped performing, my ears became curious again. I started catching tone, pauses, emphasis. The music of English, not just the words. This is how natives really listen. They don't translate every word. They listen for intention. And intention lives in rhythm, not grammar. During that week, English stopped feeling like an exam and started feeling like background music. I wasn't learning about the language. I was living inside it. Hearing the same phrases every day. In the kitchen. In the car. In quiet conversations before sleep. It's been a long day. We'll figure it out. I'm here. Simple sentences. Native sentences. Sentences no textbook ever highlights. And something else softened too. My relationship. When I stopped hiding behind silence, connection came back, not because my English improved, but because my presence did. If you're struggling with English right now, especially in a relationship, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not failing because you don't know enough words. You're struggling because you care. And caring uses energy. Emotional language is the hardest language there is. You don't need perfect English to be understood. You need safety, repetition, and permission to be slow. When you feel safe, your ears open. When your ears open, your English follows. That's the part no one tells you. So if you're watching this while questioning your relationship, your decision to stay, or your ability to survive in America, pause for a second. You're not behind. You're adapting. And adaptation looks messy before it looks fluent. The question isn't whether love and language will clash. They always do. The real question is whether you'll stay present long enough for them to learn how to move together. Would you try again? There's a strange moment that comes after disappointment. Not right when things fall apart. Not when you feel angry or sad. But later, when everything goes quiet. That moment usually arrives when you're alone. In your car. In the shower. Lying awake at night. It sounds simple, almost harmless, but it's heavy. What if I stop trying? That question visited me. Near the end of my 4th week in America. By then, I wasn't dramatic anymore. I wasn't emotional. I was just tired. Tired of translating myself. Tired of explaining why simple conversations felt hard. Tired of pretending that small failures didn't hurt. I had done what many people do right before quitting. I became numb. And numbness is dangerous because it feels calm. One morning, I realized something unsettling. I hadn't failed that day. Nothing went wrong. But I also hadn't tried. I stayed quiet. I avoided interaction. I stayed inside my comfort zone. And for a brief moment, that felt like relief. That's when it hit me. This is how quitting actually happens. Not with a big decision, but with a series of small withdrawals. Here's what surprised me most. The moment I stopped forcing progress, something else started happening quietly. My ears began to recognize patterns. Not vocabulary lists. Not grammar rules. Patterns. The way people pause before answering. The way tone softens when someone is kind. The way natives repeat ideas in simple language when they care. That's how children learn language. And that's how adults relearn it if they let go of ego. I started noticing the same phrases showing up everywhere. At the coffee shop. On the phone. At home. You're all set. Take it easy. Let me know. At some point, I realized I wasn't translating them anymore. I was just responding. And that scared me a little, because it meant something was changing without effort. We often believe improvement must feel intense. Studying harder. Pushing longer. Forcing results. But language doesn't grow that way. It grows through exposure and emotional safety. When your nervous system relaxes, your brain stops blocking information. Your ears stop defending. They start receiving. That's what listening like a native actually means. Natives aren't better listeners because they're smarter. They're better listeners because they're not afraid. Fear is what closes your ears. Fear of sounding stupid. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of confirming your own doubts. Once fear takes over, your brain shifts from learning mode into protection mode. And protection mode doesn't care about fluency. When I understood that, I made a quiet decision, not a dramatic promise. I decided I wouldn't quit today. Not forever. Just today. I didn't set goals. I didn't make schedules. I didn't tell myself I'd be better tomorrow. I simply stayed present. I listened without panicking. I responded without apologizing for my accent. I allowed pauses to exist. And something unexpected happened. Conversations became slower, but warmer. My partner listened differently. I listened differently too. When I stopped measuring myself against native speakers, I started connecting with them. People weren't judging my English the way I thought they were. Most of them were just waiting to be understood, and to understand me back. This is something people rarely say out loud. Americans are not impatient with accents. They're impatient with distance. When you show up honestly, they meet you halfway. But honesty requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is terrifying in a second language. Still, it's the only path forward. By the end of that 4th week, I didn't feel successful. I felt grounded. And that was new. I realized success isn't the absence of failure. It's the willingness to return after failing quietly. That's when the title questions started sounding different to me. Would you try again? Not try harder. Not try faster. Just try again. Would you speak even when your sentence isn't perfect? Would you listen even when you miss half the words? Would you stay even when your confidence hasn't caught up yet? Because here's the truth no algorithm or course will tell you. Fluency doesn't come from confidence. Confidence comes from surviving confusion without leaving. If you're watching this and you feel behind, you're not broken. You're early. If you feel tired, it doesn't mean you're failing. It means you've been trying in a place that doesn't speak your language yet. And if you're standing on the edge, wondering whether to quit English, quit America, or quit a version of yourself you're not proud of anymore, pause. Ask yourself the real question. Not, can I succeed? But, can I stay? Because staying is how your ears adapt. Staying is how your heart adjusts. Staying is how language stops being a wall and becomes a bridge. I failed repeatedly. In America. quietly, slowly, honestly. And I'm still here. So now I ask you, without pressure, without drama, after failing like this, would you try again? When English stopped being a tool. There's a moment when a tool stops feeling helpful and starts feeling heavy. Not because it's broken, but because you're using it under pressure. That's what English became for me around the end of week 4. At first, English was something practical. A way to survive. Ask questions. Follow rules. Get things done. But slowly, quietly, it stopped being a tool and started becoming a test. Every interaction felt like a measurement of my worth. Every sentence felt like evidence, either for or against me. You don't notice this shift right away. It sneaks in. You start replaying conversations after they end. You wonder if you sounded rude. You worry if your tone was wrong. You think about what you should have said hours too late. English was no longer just language. It was judgment. One afternoon, I realized I was preparing for conversations that hadn't happened yet. Practicing answers in my head. Imagining misunderstandings. Bracing myself. That's not communication. That's defense. And when language becomes something you defend yourself with, your brain treats it like danger. Here's the strange thing. The more I tried to use English correctly, the worse it felt. I spoke less. I listened with tension. I waited for mistakes instead of meaning. This is where many people give up, not because they can't learn English, but because English stops feeling human. It turns into a wall instead of a bridge. Neuroscience explains this better than motivation ever could. When your brain senses pressure, it prioritizes safety over growth. Blood flow shifts away from areas responsible for complex processing, like language, and towards survival systems. That's why your mind goes blank. That's why you forget words you already know. That's why your listening collapses under stress. Your brain isn't betraying you. It's protecting you. Once I understood that, I stopped blaming myself for not improving. I asked a different question. When did English stop feeling safe? The answer surprised me. It wasn't when I moved to America. It was when I started expecting English to prove something about me. That I was smart enough, worthy enough, ready enough. That's too much weight for a language to carry. So I tried something uncomfortable. I stopped using English as a performance tool. I let it be messy again. Incomplete. Sometimes wrong. I allowed myself to say things like, I don't know how to explain this yet. Can I say it slowly? I might use the wrong word. But those sentences don't sound advanced. But they changed everything. Because the moment I admitted imperfection, pressure dropped. Conversations slowed down. People leaned in instead of pulling away. And suddenly, English felt like cooperation, not competition. That's when my listening changed. Before, I listened to catch mistakes. Now, I listened for intention. I stopped focusing on individual words and started hearing patterns. Repetition. Emphasis. The emotional shape of sentences. This is what people mean when they say, train your ears like a native, but they rarely explain it this way. Natives don't listen harder. They listen softer. They're not tense. They're curious. They're not translating. They're predicting. They already know roughly what's coming. So their ears relax. And relaxed ears hear more. Once I stopped forcing English to work for me, it started working with me. I noticed how often Americans simplify without realizing it. How they rephrase when they sense confusion. How tone carries more meaning than vocabulary. A gentle yeah can mean agreement, hesitation, or kindness, depending on how it's said. You don't learn that from textbooks. You learn it by staying present. There was a moment that made this clear. Someone explained something to me, and I missed part of it. Old me would have nodded and hoped for the best. Instead, I said, I didn't catch that last part. No apology. No embarrassment. Just honesty. They repeated it. Slower. Kinder. And nothing bad happened. That's when it hit me. English didn't fail me. My relationship with English did. When you treat language like a weapon, to defend your intelligence or protect your ego, it turns against you. When you treat it like a shared space, it opens. If you're listening to this and English feels heavy right now, I want you to know this. You're not stuck because you're bad at English. You're stuck because you're trying to carry it alone. Language is social. It wants cooperation. The moment you allow yourself to be imperfect out loud, your ears learn faster than any study plan could teach them. Because learning accelerates when fear leaves the room. By the end of that week, English still wasn't easy. But it wasn't threatening anymore. It went back to being what it was supposed to be, a bridge. A tool. A shared attempt at understanding. And once English stopped judging me, I stopped judging myself. That's usually when real progress begins, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. Like a door unlocking from the inside. Lonely in a crowded country. There's a special kind of loneliness that only exists in crowded places. Not the dramatic kind. Not the obvious kind. The quiet kind that shows up when you're surrounded by people and still feel invisible. That's the loneliness that found me in America. I noticed it one afternoon while standing in line at a busy store. People were talking, laughing, complaining about small things. The room was full of sound. English everywhere. And yet, none of it felt like it was meant for me. I was physically present, but emotionally outside the circle. Like standing behind glass. Loneliness doesn't always mean being alone. Sometimes it means being unable to enter the moment. When English isn't automatic, every interaction costs energy. You listen harder than everyone else. You analyze tone. You guess intention. By the time you're ready to respond, the conversation has already moved on. So you smile. You nod. You let it pass. And slowly, you start choosing isolation, not because you want to be alone, but because you're tired of being late to your own life. In my 5th week, I realized how much energy I was spending just being ready to interact, ready to misunderstand, ready to apologize, ready to feel embarrassed. That kind of readiness keeps your nervous system tense all day. And a tense nervous system doesn't learn well. That's why loneliness and language are deeply connected. When you feel disconnected, your brain stays alert. It scans for threats. It assumes rejection before it happens. And when your brain is busy protecting you, it has very little space left for listening deeply. So your ears close, not because English is hard, but because loneliness is loud. There was a night when this became painfully clear. I was sitting next to my partner on the couch. Same room. Same space. But we were living in different emotional worlds. I wanted to share how isolated I felt. but the words felt too heavy, too complicated to translate. So I stayed quiet. Silence filled the room again. That silence wasn't peaceful. It was unfinished. This is the part many people don't talk about when they move to a new country. Loneliness doesn't just affect your mood. It shapes your identity. It makes you feel smaller, less articulate, less interesting. You start believing that the quieter version of yourself is the real one. But it's not. It's just the tired one. Psychology tells us that humans learn best through connection. Our brains evolved to pick up language in social environments, through shared attention, emotional safety, and repetition. When you feel isolated, that learning loop breaks. You hear words, but they don't stick. You listen, but nothing lands. That's why studying harder doesn't always help. Sometimes, what you're missing isn't discipline. It's belonging. I didn't fix my loneliness by suddenly making friends or becoming more confident. I did something much smaller. I started allowing micro-connections. A short, "Hey" to the same cashier. A brief comment about the weather. A quiet "Thanks, appreciate it" said clearly and slowly. These weren't conversations. They were acknowledgments. And something shifted. Those small exchanges didn't make me fluent, but they made me visible. And visibility softened the loneliness. When loneliness softened, my ears opened again. I started noticing how often people repeated phrases, how rhythm mattered more than vocabulary, how tone carried reassurance even when words were simple. That's how natives listen. Not for perfection, but for presence. I also noticed something uncomfortable about myself. I had been waiting for confidence to return before rejoining the world. But confidence doesn't come first. Connection does. Confidence is what grows after you feel seen. Once I stopped hiding behind silence, even imperfect English felt lighter. I didn't need to say much. I just needed to stay in the moment long enough for it to include me. Loneliness teaches you something important if you listen to it carefully. It's not telling you to give up. It's telling you to slow down, to stop performing, to stop proving, and to start participating, awkwardly, imperfectly, humanly. If you're watching this and you feel isolated right now, especially while learning English, I want you to know this isn't a personal failure. It's a natural response to living between languages, cultures, and identities. Your brain is doing its best to keep you safe. But safety doesn't come from isolation. It comes from gentle exposure. The moment you let yourself be a little uncomfortable, just enough to connect, your ears adapt. Your mind relaxes. Language begins to feel less like noise and more like invitation. America is crowded. English is everywhere. And yet, connection happens quietly, one small moment at a time. You don't have to belong everywhere. You just have to belong somewhere. And sometimes, that somewhere starts with a simple sentence, spoken slowly, without fear. That's not weakness. That's how listening begins. Marriage under silent pressure. There's a kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't start arguments. It just sits there, between two people, getting heavier over time. That's the pressure that settled into my marriage during those weeks in America. No one prepares you for how much language affects love. Not the romantic kind of language. The daily kind. The ordinary words you use to explain how tired you are, what you're afraid of, what you need right now. When those words don't come easily, you don't stop feeling, you stop sharing. And that's where the silence begins. Living in the US changed our rhythm. Different schedules, different expectations, different stressors, bills, paperwork, rules we didn't grow up with. And on top of that, English always present, always demanding attention. It wasn't dramatic. We weren't fighting, but something was off. Conversations became shorter. Topics stayed shallow. Important things were postponed for later. Later kept getting further away. One evening, I realized how careful I had become. Not careful with my partner, but careful with my English. I chose words that were safe, not honest. I simplified feelings until they lost their shape. Instead of saying what I really felt, I said things that were easy to say. I'm fine. It's okay. Don't worry. Those phrases sound harmless. But when they replace real emotion too often, they become walls. Marriage doesn't need perfect communication, but it does need presence. And presence is hard when you're translating yourself in your head. There was a moment when my partner asked me a question, not aggressively, not emotionally, just a normal question about the future. I understood the words, but the weight of the question hit me late. By the time I answered, my response sounded distant. I could see confusion on their face. Not because of what I said, but because of what I didn't say. That's when it hit me. English wasn't just slowing my speech. It was slowing my emotional timing. And timing matters in love. Psychologically, this makes sense. Emotional conversations require fast processing. You're reading tone, facial expressions, pauses. When you add a second language, your brain has to work twice as hard. Under stress, it prioritizes accuracy over intimacy. You don't say the wrong thing, but you also don't say the real thing. Your brain thinks it's helping. Your relationship feels the cost. Once I saw that, I stopped asking, why am I bad at this? And started asking, how can I make this safer? Not easier. Safer. I began doing something very small but very uncomfortable. I warned before I spoke. I need a second. I know what I feel, but I need time to say it. This might sound simple, but it's important to me. Those sentences didn't fix everything, but they changed the atmosphere. They bought me time. They signaled care even when my words lagged behind my emotions. And something surprising happened. My listening improved too. When the pressure dropped, my ears stopped bracing for impact. I wasn't listening to defend myself anymore. I was listening to understand. I started noticing tone instead of grammar, intention instead of structure, the emotional rhythm underneath the words. That's what native listening really is. Natives don't hear faster because they're smarter. They hear faster because they're relaxed. When you feel emotionally safe, your brain predicts what's coming next. It fills in gaps. It doesn't panic when it misses a word. That's why your listening collapses during arguments, but improves during calm moments. Language follows emotion. As our conversations slowed down, they deepened. Not because my English improved dramatically, but because I stayed present longer. I stopped rushing to finish sentences. I allowed silence to exist without panicking. Silence stopped being a failure and became a pause. And pauses can be intimate if you let them. Marriage under pressure doesn't always look broken. Sometimes it looks functional but distant. Polite but hollow. And that's dangerous because it's easy to ignore. You tell yourself it's temporary, that things will improve once your English gets better, once life settles down. But connection doesn't wait for fluency. If you're learning English while trying to protect a relationship, I want you to hear this clearly. Your imperfect words are not the problem. Your fear of using them is. Love doesn't require elegance. It requires honesty delivered at human speed. You don't need to explain everything perfectly. You need to show that you're still here. By the end of that week, nothing was magically solved. We still had stress. We still had misunderstandings. But something softened. We stopped competing with the language and started cooperating. With it, English became something we navigated together, not something standing between us. That's when I realized something important. A relationship doesn't break because language is hard. It breaks when silence replaces effort. If you're watching this and feeling pressure in your own relationship, especially in a new country, don't wait to sound fluent. Speak while you're slow. Listen while you're unsure. Stay while it's uncomfortable. That's not weakness. That's commitment. And commitment, like language, grows best when it's allowed to be imperfect and real. Love didn't speak perfect English. There's a quiet lie many of us believe when we move to a new country. We think love will wait until we're fluent. Until our sentences sound confident. Until our listening feels effortless. But love doesn't wait. It arrives early. And it speaks before you're ready. That truth hit me somewhere between week 3 and week 4 in America. During a moment that looked completely ordinary from the outside. We were in the kitchen. Nothing emotional on the calendar. Just two people sharing space after a long day. And yet, that was where I finally understood something important. Love never required perfect English. I was the one who did. When English feels fragile, you start protecting it. You avoid emotional conversations because emotions don't come with subtitles. You save deep feelings for later, when your words will be better, clearer, safer. But later doesn't respect schedules. Life keeps moving. Love keeps happening. And if you don't show up imperfectly, you don't show up at all. I had been waiting for fluency to arrive before letting myself be fully seen. I didn't say that out loud. But I lived it. I filtered my thoughts. I shortened my feelings. I chose sentences that were grammatically safe instead of emotionally true. And slowly, without realizing it, I created distance. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. There's something deeply exhausting about loving someone in a second language. You're not just listening to words. You're listening to tone, mood, timing, while your brain is translating, correcting, and checking itself. By the time you respond, the moment has often shifted. So you rush, or you freeze, or you default to something neutral. And neutral is the enemy of intimacy. One night, my partner said something small. Not a complaint. Not a demand. Just an observation. In my native language, I would have responded instinctively with warmth, humor, reassurance. In English, my response came out stiff. Technically correct. Emotionally empty. I saw it immediately. That flicker of confusion. That moment of, are we okay? That's when it hit me. I wasn't failing at English. I was failing to trust that love could survive my imperfect English. So I tried something different. Something risky. I stopped editing my emotions. Instead of finding the perfect sentence, I said what came first, even if it sounded simple. even if it felt childish. I miss you. I feel far today. I don't have the right words, but this matters. Those sentences won't impress anyone, but they carry weight. And weight is what love responds to. Something shifted after that. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But the atmosphere softened. Conversations slowed down. Silence stopped feeling dangerous. It became shared instead of lonely. And here's the part one didn't expect. My listening improved too. When I stopped performing, my ears stopped panicking. I wasn't listening for mistakes anymore. I was listening for meaning. I began to catch the emotional shape of sentences, the rise, the fall, the pause before something important. This is how native listening really works. Natives don't hear every word clearly. They feel where the sentence is going. They rely on context, emotion, familiarity. And when you feel emotionally connected, your brain predicts better. It fills in gaps. It relaxes. That's why listening feels easier with people you trust, even in a language you don't fully control. Love created that trust. I started realizing that many of the phrases I struggled with before were actually very simple. I just hadn't heard them clearly because I was tense. Are you okay? I'm just tired. We'll be fine. These sentences aren't advanced English, but they carry emotional fluency. And emotional fluency matters more than vocabulary size. There's research that supports this. Emotional safety reduces cognitive load. When you feel safe, your brain processes language more efficiently. When you feel judged by yourself or others, processing slows down. That's why love can accelerate language learning in ways no course ever could. But only if you let it. For a long time, I didn't. I tried to protect love by being quiet, by waiting, by improving privately. But love doesn't grow in isolation. It grows in shared moments, even awkward ones. Once I accepted that my English didn't need to be perfect to be meaningful, something else happened. I stopped measuring myself against native speakers. I stopped apologizing for pauses. I allowed my accent to exist without explanation. And people leaned in. Not because my English improved dramatically, but because my presence did. If you're learning English and trying to hold on to love at the same time, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need better grammar to be loved. You need courage to be seen while you're still learning. Love is patient, but it's not passive. It asks you to show up with what you have, not what you plan to have someday. English will improve with time. Listening will sharpen with exposure. But connection only happens now. So don't wait to sound native. Don't wait to feel confident. Speak while your voice shakes. Listen while you're unsure. Because love doesn't speak perfect English. It speaks presence. It speaks effort. It speaks honesty, slowly, imperfectly, and deeply human. And when you allow that kind of love into your learning, your ears follow your heart faster than you ever expected. Learning English without sitting down. There's a moment when you realize the problem isn't that you're bad at studying. The problem is that you're exhausted from trying to study your way into belonging. That realization came to me quietly, sometime after week 4, when I noticed I hadn't opened a textbook in days, and yet, somehow, English felt closer. Not easier. Just closer. Like a sound you don't fully understand yet, but no longer want to run away from. I didn't decide to stop studying. I just stopped sitting down to learn. Life didn't give me that option anymore. In America, English doesn't wait for you to be ready. It shows up when you're half awake at the grocery store. It speaks to you through drive-through speakers, voicemail messages, casual jokes you almost catch but miss by a second. It doesn't ask if this is a good time to practice listening. At first, that constant exposure felt cruel, like being tested without permission. But something strange happened when I stopped labeling every moment as practice. My ears relaxed. When you sit down to study, there's pressure. You expect progress. You measure results. You judge yourself. But when English happens while you're living, while you're tired, distracted, human, you listen differently. Not to succeed, just to survive the moment. And survival listening is surprisingly powerful. I started noticing patterns instead of words. The same phrases appearing again and again in different places. Let me check. That makes sense. Give me a second. I wasn't memorizing them. I was recognizing them. Recognition is what natives rely on. They don't analyze every sentence. They anticipate. They predict. Their brains already know the shape of what's coming. That's when it clicked. Listening like a native isn't about speed. It's about familiarity. You don't get familiarity from cramming. You get it from repetition inside real contexts. One morning, I overheard a short exchange between two strangers. I didn't catch every word, but I understood the situation, the tone, the intention. And without translating, my body reacted before my brain did. I nodded internally. I got it. That moment was small, but it mattered more than any vocabulary list I'd ever completed. Because it proved something important. My ears were learning even when I wasn't trying to teach them. Neuroscience backs this up. The brain absorbs language more efficiently when attention is low but consistent. This is called implicit learning. It's how children learn. And it's how adults relearn, when they stop interfering with anxiety and control. When you sit down to study, your conscious brain takes over. It wants rules, accuracy, results. But listening lives in a different system. It thrives on rhythm, emotion, and repetition. When your conscious brain relaxes, your listening brain wakes up. That's why English suddenly felt clearer when I was doing dishes or driving. I wasn't demanding understanding. I was allowing exposure. Of course, there were days when I felt behind again. When conversations moved too fast. When jokes landed and I missed them. But instead of spiraling, I noticed something new. I stayed. I didn't withdraw. I didn't punish myself. Staying changed everything. Staying meant hearing the same phrases again tomorrow. Staying meant context slowly filled the gaps. Staying meant English stopped being an event and became an environment. This is the part most courses don't teach you because it can't be packaged easily. You don't learn English by adding more effort. You absorb it by removing fear. Once fear leaves, your ears do their job naturally. I also stopped multitasking while listening. Not in a disciplined way, but in a curious way. I let sentences finish before reacting. I noticed pauses. The way people soften their voice when they're unsure. The way Americans repeat information slightly differently when they want to help. That repetition isn't accidental. It's cultural kindness. And when you expect it, listening becomes less stressful. I realized I didn't need to understand everything. I just needed to understand enough to stay connected. That's native listening. Natives miss words all the time. They rely on redundancy, context, shared assumptions. The difference is they don't panic when they miss something. Panic is what breaks listening. Once I stopped sitting down to fix my English stopped fighting back. It met me where I was, in half-finished thoughts, in tired evenings, in quiet mornings when my guard was down. And slowly, without effort, sentences started completing themselves in my head. Not perfectly, but naturally. If you're struggling right now, feeling like you've studied for years and still don't get it, I want you to consider this. Maybe you're not failing. Maybe you're over-controlling. You don't need more pressure. You need more permission. Permission to listen without understanding. Permission to stay without responding perfectly. Permission to learn while living. English is not something you conquer sitting at a desk. It's something you grow into by staying present long enough. So stop waiting for the perfect study plan. Stop measuring every interaction. Stop asking if you're improving fast enough. Just stay. Stay in the room. Stay in the conversation. Stay in the country if you can. Because the moment you stop sitting down to learn English and start letting English walk beside you through ordinary life, your ears will do what they were always meant to do. They'll adapt. Quietly. Naturally. Like a native. Small moments that changed my mind. Big changes rarely announce themselves. They don't knock. They don't make speeches. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments you almost ignore. The shift for me didn't come from a breakthrough conversation or a sudden improvement in English. It came from a series of moments so small I almost dismissed them until I realized they were changing how I saw everything. One morning, I held the door open for someone. They smiled and said, "Thanks, I appreciate it." I didn't translate the sentence. I didn't analyze the grammar. I just nodded and felt included. That feeling stayed with me longer than it should have. Another day, a cashier looked tired and said, "Long day, huh?" I answered, "Yeah, a bit." Nothing impressive. No clever phrasing. But the exchange felt complete. Natural. Human. I walked away realizing something uncomfortable. English hadn't been blocking me in those moments. My expectations had. We often believe progress must feel dramatic to be real. We look for moments where everything suddenly clicks. But language doesn't work like that. It shifts quietly through repetition and emotional neutrality. Through moments where you're not trying to be better, just trying to be present. That's what changed my mind. I started paying attention to how often people around me kept things simple. Native speakers don't decorate their sentences the way learners expect them to. They repeat themselves. They rephrase. They pause. They leave thoughts unfinished. And no one panics. Once I noticed that, I stopped panicking too. I remember missing part of a sentence during a conversation. Instead of freezing, I said, "Sorry, what was that last part?" My voice didn't shake. I didn't apologize 5 times. They repeated it. Slower. With a smile. And the world didn't collapse. That moment mattered more than any lesson I'd ever completed. Because it rewired something in my brain. Psychologically, small successes are powerful because they lower threat perception. When your brain realizes nothing bad happens after a mistake, it stops activating defensive systems. Listening becomes easier not because your English improves, but because fear steps aside. And fear has always been the real problem. I began noticing how often I almost understood something, and how that was usually enough. A joke where I caught the setup but missed the punchline. Instructions where I understood the action but not every word. Conversations where I followed the emotion, even if details slipped by. That almost understanding used to frustrate me. Now I welcomed it, because almost meant my ears were working. Native listeners live in almost all the time. They rely on context, shared knowledge, and emotional cues. They don't wait for perfect clarity. They move forward with partial information and adjust as they go. That's a skill, and it's learnable. Another small moment came during a quiet evening at home. Someone on TV said a phrase I'd heard dozens of times before. But this time, I didn't think about it. I just understood it instantly. No translation. No pause. It passed through me like background noise, and that's when I noticed it. When language becomes background, your ears have adapted. That doesn't mean you're fluent. It means you're comfortable. Comfort is the foundation everything else builds on. I also noticed my relationship with silence changing. Silence used to feel like failure. Like proof I didn't belong in the conversation. But now silence felt neutral. Sometimes even respectful. I stopped rushing to fill gaps. I let conversations breathe. Americans are comfortable with pauses. Learners often aren't. Once I allowed silence to exist, my listening sharpened. I heard what came after the pause. Often, that's where meaning lives. These small moments didn't make me confident overnight, but they made me calmer. And calm is underrated. Calm is when your ears actually work. You don't listen well when you're trying to impress. You listen well when you're not afraid. That realization changed how I approached every interaction. I stopped asking, "Did I say that right?" and started asking, "Did we understand each other?" Those are very different questions. One leads to anxiety. The other leads to connection. If you're watching this and waiting for a big sign that you're improving, I want to gently challenge you. You might be overlooking the signs because they're quiet. They don't feel like victories. They feel like normal life. And that's the point. Language mastery doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as a reduction of friction. Things feel smoother, less effortful, less loud in your head. Those small moments, doors held open, casual comments, repeated phrases, are not distractions from learning. They are the learning. Once I understood that, I stopped hunting for progress and started noticing it. And noticing it made me want to stay. Stay in conversations. Stay in discomfort. Stay in the country. Stay in the process. Because when small moments stop feeling heavy, big goals stop feeling impossible. And that's how your mind changes, not all at once, but quietly, through moments you almost miss. The day I almost gave up and why I didn't. There is always a day when quitting feels logical. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just reasonable. For me, that day came near the end of the 4th week in America. Nothing went terribly wrong. That was the problem. It was a collection of small failures stacked so close together that my mind started whispering, maybe this isn't for you. A conversation where I smiled, but didn't understand. A form I filled out incorrectly. A joke everyone laughed at except me. By the evening, I felt empty. Not angry. Not sad. Just tired of trying. That's the most dangerous state. When you're emotional, you still care. When you're tired, you start negotiating with your dreams. You tell yourself stories that sound wise, but are really just fear. In professional clothing, you've tried enough. You're not built for this environment. You can stop now and still respect yourself. Those thoughts didn't attack me. They sat beside me calmly, like old friends. And that scared me. I remember sitting alone, replaying the day in my head. Every moment where English felt like a wall instead of a bridge. Every second where listening felt like guessing. I asked myself a quiet question: what am I really failing at? It wasn't English. It was expectation. I expected progress to feel rewarding. I expected effort to feel visible. I expected adaptation to come with reassurance. But real growth doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence and confusion and long stretches where nothing seems to improve. That night, I didn't study. I didn't motivate myself. I didn't watch inspirational videos. I just sat with the discomfort long enough for something honest to surface. I realized I wasn't afraid of failing anymore. I was afraid of failing again. Repeated failure hits differently. The first few times, you bounce back with hope. After a while, hope starts asking for proof. And when proof doesn't show up, quitting feels like self-respect. But here's what changed everything. I noticed that even on my worst days, I was still listening. Not perfectly. Not confidently, but actively. I was still catching fragments, still understanding tone, still sensing when a conversation was light or serious. My ears hadn't shut down even when my motivation had. That mattered, because listening is the first thing fear tries to steal. When you stop listening, you isolate. When you isolate, everything feels harder than it is. But if you're still listening, really listening, you're still in the game. Native level listening isn't about understanding every word. It's about staying open long enough for meaning to land. And meaning doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it arrives hours later. When your brain replays a sentence and suddenly understands it. That happened to me that night. A phrase someone had said earlier, something casual, replayed in my head. And this time, it clicked. Not because I tried harder, but because I relaxed. The understanding came quietly, like a delayed message finally delivered. That moment didn't fix my day, but it fixed my decision. I realized quitting wouldn't come from clarity. It would come from exhaustion pretending to be wisdom. And staying wouldn't come from confidence. It would come from patience. So I made a small promise, not a dramatic one. I didn't promise to succeed. I didn't promise to improve faster. I just promised not to decide on my worst day. That's something no one tells you. Never make permanent decisions in temporary fatigue. The next morning, nothing felt magically better. But the heaviness had softened. I noticed I was listening again, not for correctness, but for rhythm. The way sentences rose and fell. The way Americans often start speaking before they fully know how they'll end a sentence. That's not textbook English. That's lived English. And you only hear it when you stop judging yourself. I stopped measuring my progress in vocabulary and started measuring it in tolerance. How long could I stay in a conversation without escaping mentally? How comfortable could I be with partial understanding? Those became my real metrics. Because quitting doesn't usually come from inability. It comes from the belief that the effort is no longer worth the cost. But effort feels costly only when you expect certainty in return. There is no certainty here, only accumulation. Listening improves by staying exposed. Confidence improves by surviving awkwardness. Belonging improves by not leaving too soon. By the end of that week, I still wasn't fluent. I still missed things. But I noticed something subtle. I was no longer imagining my exit. I wasn't counting days backward. I was present again. And presence is a choice you make daily. If you're watching this and standing on the edge of quitting language learning, a relationship, a life chapter, I want you to hear this slowly. The urge to quit doesn't mean you're weak. It means you've been strong for a long time without rest. Don't confuse fatigue with truth. Rest if you need to. Slow down. Lower your expectations. But don't walk away just because the progress stopped announcing itself. Sometimes, the only difference between those who quit and those who continue is one quiet decision made on a very ordinary, very heavy night. I didn't continue because I believed I would win. I continued because I realized I was still listening. And as long as you're listening, the story isn't over yet. The quiet week when nothing changed except me. There's a strange kind of disappointment that shows up after you decide not to quit. It's not dramatic. It doesn't hurt loudly. It just asks, okay, so where's the reward? Week 3 slid into week 4 like that for me. After the almost quitting moment, I expected something to shift. Confidence. Clarity. Momentum. At least a sign. That staying was the right choice. None came. Instead, life continued in the most ordinary way possible. I still misunderstood people. I still nodded too quickly in conversations. I still replayed sentences in my head, wondering if I had answered correctly or just confidently wrong. Nothing about my English looked impressive from the outside. And that's when a new temptation appeared. Not quitting, but rushing. The urge to force progress. To push harder. To demand results. To turn every conversation into a test. To treat listening like a battlefield instead of a skill. That urge is sneaky. It disguises itself as discipline. But it's actually fear that staying patient won't be enough. One afternoon, I was standing in line somewhere mundane. A place where people chat casually with strangers. The kind of environment that used to make my shoulders tense. This time, I didn't tense up. Not because I felt confident, but because I felt tired of fighting. Reality. I let the sounds wash over me. I didn't chase every word. I didn't panic when I missed something. I focused on tone, pace, emotion. Whether the speaker was joking or serious. And something unexpected happened. I understood without translating. Not everything. Not perfectly. But enough. It wasn't a breakthrough moment you'd put in a movie. No music. No sudden joy. Just a quiet realization that my brain had been working in the background this entire time, without my permission, without my pressure. That's the part no one tells you about training your ears like a native. Your ears don't improve when you attack them. They improve when you stop interrupting them. Native speakers don't listen word by word. They listen in chunks. In intentions. In patterns. And those patterns only reveal themselves when you give them time to repeat. That week, I stopped correcting myself mentally during conversations. I stopped rewinding sentences in real time. I let myself miss things and trusted that meaning would still arrive. It often did. Later. Quietly. On its own schedule. Around the same time, something shifted at home too. When you're struggling externally, it leaks into your relationships. Small misunderstandings feel heavier. Silence feels personal. You carry frustration you can't name, and it settles between two people like invisible fog. We weren't arguing. We weren't fighting. But we were tired in different ways. One night, we talked, not deeply, not dramatically, but honestly, about how disorienting it feels to rebuild yourself in a new country. About how exhausting it is to be patient all day long. About how easy it is to mistake silence for failure. That conversation didn't solve anything, but it reminded me that progress doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like staying connected while nothing improves on the surface. That matters for language learning too. You don't build fluency by chasing perfection. You build it by staying present long enough for familiarity to grow. Familiarity is boring, repetitive, unimpressive, but it works. By the end of that week, I noticed I was laughing more naturally. Not because I understood every joke, but because I understood when laughter belonged. Timing matters more than vocabulary. Tone matters more than grammar. That's native listening. It's sensing the room, reading pauses, knowing when not to speak. Those skills don't announce themselves. They just quietly replace anxiety. If you're close to quitting, there's a chance you're standing in the most invisible phase of progress. The phase where nothing changes outwardly, but everything internal is reorganizing. Your brain is sorting patterns. Your ears are adjusting filters. Your confidence is learning restraint instead of force. And because none of that looks impressive, you assume it's not happening. But it is. Quitting now wouldn't mean you failed. It would mean you left right before familiarity turned into ease. That's the cruel timing of growth. It feels pointless right up until it works. I didn't feel proud that week. I didn't feel inspired. I felt ordinary. And that was new. Because ordinary means the fear has loosened its grip. If you're watching this and wondering whether staying is worth it, ask yourself a different question. Am I actually stuck, or am I just bored with being patient? Because patience doesn't feel heroic. It feels dull. And most people don't quit because they can't do something. They quit because they can't tolerate the boredom of becoming competent. That week taught me something important. Progress doesn't need your approval to happen. It just needs your presence. So if all you can do right now is stay, listen imperfectly, and show up tired, that's not failure. That's training. The ending I didn't expect, but needed. There's a moment near the end of any hard chapter where nothing dramatic happens. No victory speech. No clear finish line. Just a quiet sense that you're no longer the same person who almost gave up. That's where my 4th week in America ended. Not with success, but with stability. I didn't suddenly feel fluent. I didn't wake up confident. I still missed words. Still misunderstood jokes. Still had days where English felt like fog instead of air. But something fundamental had shifted. I stopped asking, am I good enough to stay? And started asking, why would I leave now? That difference matters. Because quitting is usually framed as an action. But more often, it's a story you slowly tell yourself. A story where struggle becomes evidence, not just experience. A story where discomfort means disqualification. I had been telling myself that story quietly for weeks. And then, without realizing it, I stopped. One afternoon, I caught myself doing something small but revealing. I was listening to a conversation, not trying to learn, not trying to decode, not trying to improve. Just listening while doing something else. The way native speakers do. That's when it hit me. I wasn't studying English anymore. I was living around it. That's the shift no course promises you. The point where language stops being the main character and becomes background noise, sometimes confusing, sometimes clear, but always present. Your ears don't sharpen in moments of effort. They sharpen in moments of normalcy. That's what training your ears like a native actually looks like. Not drills. Not pressure. But repeated exposure without emotional weight. The same way children learn, not by understanding everything, but by hearing everything. Around that time, my relationship felt different too. Not easier, but steadier. When you go through sustained uncertainty together, you either grow brittle or flexible. We didn't solve all our problems, but we stopped interpreting struggle as a sign of failure. We started treating it as shared weather. Some days are cold. Some days are heavy. But weather passes. That mindset bled into everything else. When English felt hard, I didn't panic. When progress felt slow, I didn't spiral. When motivation dipped, I didn't dramatize it. I had failed repeatedly, but failure had lost its threat. And that's when I realized the ending of this story was never about success. It was about tolerance. How much uncertainty could I hold without escaping? How much discomfort could I allow without turning it into meaning? How long could I stay present without demanding reassurance? Those are adult skills. Native skills. Life skills. By the end of week 4, I wasn't proud of my progress, but I trusted it. I trusted that something invisible was accumulating. That my ears were adapting even when my confidence wasn't. That trust is rare. Most people quit right before trust forms. Because trust doesn't feel exciting. It feels calm. And calm can feel like stagnation if you're addicted to urgency. If you're listening to this while standing at the edge, language learning, a relationship, a new life, you're probably not lacking ability. You're lacking safety. Safety to be bad at something longer than you planned. Safety to stay when results go quiet. Safety to believe that repetition without reward still counts. Here's what I wish someone had told me earlier. You don't quit when it's hard. You quit when it's unclear. And clarity doesn't arrive before commitment. It arrives because of it. Looking back, the repeated failures weren't signs to stop. They were proof that I was actually doing the thing, exposing myself to real language, real people, real unpredictability. That's not a flaw in the process. That is the process. The happy ending isn't fluency. It isn't mastery. It isn't confidence. The happy ending is staying long enough for fear to lose interest in you. Because fear feeds on urgency. It thrives when you're desperate for proof. But when you settle into the long game, when you stop asking for permission to continue, fear gets bored. And when fear gets bored, growth accelerates quietly. So if you're asking yourself the question in the title, would you try again? My answer is simple. I already did. Not by restarting. Not by resetting. But by continuing without drama. And that's the part no one celebrates, but everyone who makes it understands. If this story feels familiar, save it. Share it with someone who's tired. Or just sit with it for a moment longer. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't trying harder. It's staying. If you've made it this far, I want you to pause for a second. Not to think harder. Not to motivate yourself. Just to notice something quiet. You're still here. That already says more about you than any test score, any accent, any grammar rule ever could. Most people don't quit because they're incapable. They quit because they're tired of not knowing when it will finally feel easier. I failed again and again in America. Not loudly. Not publicly. But in those small, invisible moments where doubt whispers, this shouldn't be this hard. And yet, I stayed. Not because I was confident, but because I realized something simple. If I leave now, this story ends here. And I wasn't ready for that ending. If you're learning English, if you're starting over in a new country, if you're navigating love, marriage, or identity while feeling like you don't fully belong yet, then this channel isn't about teaching you English. It's about walking through the uncertainty with you, slowly, honestly, without pretending it's easy. Here, we train your ears like a native. Not with pressure. Not with dry lessons. But through real stories, real emotions, and real life in America, one imperfect week at a time. In the next videos, I'll share what happened after this. The moments that surprised me. The conversations I finally understood without translating. The mistakes that secretly changed everything. So if any part of this story felt like it was written for you, if you're tired of starting over alone, subscribe to this channel. Save this video for the days you feel like quitting. And come back, not because you're ready, but because you're still listening. Because as long as you're listening, your story in English and in life isn't over yet. And this is only the beginning.